In my previous video, I talked about how modern civilization has the unique ability of masking our vulnerabilities, but I specifically talked about some of the more obvious ones, the physical ones. But one thing that modern civilization absolutely does as well is it masks our psychological vulnerabilities and, more importantly, our psychology in general, which is to say, a lot of people think that how we behave has nothing to do with our evolutionary past. And if you've been with me for some years, you probably know one of my biggest pet peeves is people ignoring that fact, that you don't descend from tens of millions of years of mammalian lineages without inheriting a little bit of behavior from this. And that's a bit of an understatement. And I mention this because, in addition to being one of my big pet peeves, a persistent feature of progressive left-wing ideology, but it also has other applications. And a lot of this comes from this notion that culture emerged out of this big nowhere, and we are primarily cultural creatures. And that's kind of true, but culture had to have an antecedent. Indeed, culture had to have a precedent. And biology, the raw biology, it's been around a lot longer than culture has. But we have an obsession that was particularly developed in the 20th century with attributing to every form of psychology and behavior some sort of socialization or social conditioning. And you'll hear this repeated ad nauseum. This idea that men and women might be different, because these days increasingly people believe that men and women are the same, but that the reason for this, in fact, is because men and women are conditioned a certain way, and if we only fix that, everything would be fine, and men and women would be interchangeable, effectively, with no antecedent, no precedent. This, of course, is absurd on its face, but a lot of people believe this, and so this is one of the great triumphs of modern progressive ideology, and of our culture, in fact, of conditioning people to believe a certain thing when we know manifestly that it's not true. You simply do not escape the long track of evolution. And so there's this persistent idea in modern progressive and cultural circles, academic circles, that culture is the primary determinant of everything, and we just condition ourselves to be certain ways, and there's no background to it. And so, for example, 800,000 years ago when Homo erectus was running around, primarily biological, maybe a bit of culture, but mostly driven by his environment, his biology, and his needs. And then we get this thing called civilization as modern anatomical Homo sapiens, and wow, culture supersedes everything. And the problem with civilization is it helps mask that quite well. We always have these stories we tell ourselves, personal narratives. I call them narratives of exposition, where you explain your own behavior looking back on it, even though you don't really have access to all the details. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, for one thing, our civilization, our culture, has been driven absolutely batty by this notion that there's nothing native to human beings that mediates and regulates their behavior. And so anything goes and anything can go. And we also can't make any real predictions about human behavior because, again, anything goes and can go, and there's no reason for this. And one example I give you this is a discussion I had a while back with some progressives about the idea of aesthetics, that is, symmetry. This idea that, in general, there are near universals in terms of symmetry, certain facial proportions, features, as well as body types that males and females prefer, almost universally again, and their comeback is always that it's all culturally determined, it's all random. And one of their favorite moves to counter this is bringing up some of these rather plump women from the early modern age or the late Renaissance who were painted onto a canvas. And they say, you see, that was a different standard back then. But the problem here is they're not paying attention to all the details. Because the reason why you see these plump women painted onto a canvas is not because they were viewed as an aesthetic ideal, but because they came from nobility and families that could afford it. And so at the end of the day, it was a function of wealth and not a function of aesthetics. Aesthetics don't always correlate with wealth. There are other correlations that exist. That's not one of them. And the other important thing to note is that some of these women that you see on these paintings, well, they're not obese. They might be a little bit plump, but not obese. So this idea that everything is infinitely interchangeable is a very persistent idea they have. And they need it, of course. They need it because if you're an egalitarian, if you believe that human beings are infinitely malleable, then you can shape society to be whatever you want it to be, rather than it being a byproduct of a confluence of factors. But among these factors, biology almost certainly plays a very important role. And in the previous video, I talked a little bit about Kevin Samuels and the women he has on, and it's very illustrative, I think. And I want to give an example with respect to this of just how far gone we are in terms of ignoring certain biological imperatives and basically playing games with our own psychology. Because I think at base, most human beings have an intuitive sense of what's aesthetic and what's not, and what drives men and what drives women. Young, attractive women usually discover that their looks are premium. Most recently, some super second-rate female rapper became the highest grossing first-day entry on OnlyFans, this sort of thing. And so young women coast by on their looks for quite some time. But remember, as I brought up in the previous video, that there's a disconnect from reality. We're talking about sorceresses versus scientists. And this almost superstitious belief that just by having certain wishes, they have to map onto reality. Well, one of the interesting things I've seen emerge, and it's very well illustrated in the Kevin Samuels presentation of interacting with these women, is these women knowing and coasting by on their looks throughout their youth, their late teens and 20s, and then presenting the most bizarre arguments you could come up with respect to why they're such a catch for older, wealthier men. Women well into their 30s or 40s. They'll say things along the lines of, I have a degree, I have a master's in business administration, I earn $150,000 a year, I have a lot of experience, I own a condo, I own this. And they're citing all these things that equate to status largely, as if that were a primary driver in men's interest in them. And gentlemen, this is why this is so fascinating, this mirage of cultural conditioning, because you don't need to be an ideologue entrenched in the far left to believe these things. Because what you have here is a transition from taking advantage of your primary attributes, your primary goods, if you will, looks, and then when these looks fade, claiming some other thing is just as important. But here's the really weird thing. Why would women think that men are interested in their degrees, their money, their condos, their houses, their whatever, their cars? Why? Because women, modern women, actually believe, in this case at least, that men are motivated by their own interests, which is to say, men are motivated by women's interests. Because what do women care about when they're at that age? That the man has a nice house, a car, a fat bank account, that he has degrees, all these things that are correlated with status. And so women transfer their own mating interests onto men and believe that the world has wronged them in many cases because the men aren't showing them the same interest they used to, because they're using their own metric and thinking, well, I have all of these things, I've done pretty well for myself, why isn't the man interested in me? And it's absolutely amazing. It's amazing in the sense that it's a masterpiece of psychological hoodwinking. These women have actually hoodwinked their own minds into believing that you as a man have a primary interest in her assets, her money, and not what men are actually interested in, primarily her looks and then her personality. Kevin Samuels does describe this pretty well. He always brings up the principle of cooperation, that beyond the looks, men really want women to be cooperative. And being cooperative is sort of a euphemism, but I think it basically means not being a you-know-what and not giving you a headache all the time. So basically men want women that look good, that are basically nice to them, and don't treat them like total garbage, and don't act like you-know-what. So this, I think, is truly, truly fascinating, because in addition to all the political stuff, the weird cultural stuff, and how culture influences everything, the kind of psychological trickery you need to play on yourself to actually believe that the physical assets you've acquired, not those you were born with, your looks, are somehow most interesting to men. Women actually thinking that men are attracted to the same things they're attracted to, which drives home very well the point that Kevin Samuels makes quite frequently, that women don't know men and they don't understand men. But we've known for a long time why that's the case, because women don't care about men. Arguably, they never have, but that's become even more apparent in the modern world where women, quote unquote, don't need men. But the fact that they're so ignorant on this topic and have actually hoodwinked their own psychology into believing that somehow men think their nice car or their nice house or their bank account something of primary interest to them is actually unfathomable if you think about that. But that's the world we live in. A combination of social brainwashing, conditioning, this insistence that we are completely detached from our evolutionary past, our biology, coupled by an intense disinterest, if not an outright loathing, for men, their wants, their needs, and their desires. And so you end up in this very strange situation, so well illustrated in the conversations that Kevin Samuels has with these ladies, and you end up just scratching your head. Because ultimately, that has to be the biggest piece of social brainwashing you could ever encounter. It is absurd to a degree you cannot even comprehend, frankly. As civilization has this tendency to mask our traits and psychological tendencies and inclinations, this is only going to get worse. We're going to be living increasingly in this strange world where women coast by on their looks, and then when it's no longer applicable, start citing their bank account and their residency as reasons as to why you should have a profound interest in them. And it just doesn't map onto reality because it doesn't map onto men's interests. But then again, who really cares about men's interests these days? Not even men do. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. Please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you've not yet done so. Hit the bell icon to be informed of forthcoming videos. Share the video. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Everyone take care, and may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.